Welcome to Soul via Soul, the podcast where we embark on a journey of self-love and true wellness. I'm your host, Jada, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here with me as we dive into all things mind, body, and soul. Now, what do you say we get this thing started? Let's dive in. Today we're going to talk about something that nobody wants to talk about, and that is shame. And shame is something we all experience, not just those of us unfortunate enough to have experienced trauma in our lives. It's part of being human. It's part of the human experience. And it has the ability to influence everything about our life, how we behave, our view of ourselves, our place in the world, and how we even view the world itself. And yet most of us don't want to talk about it. We fear it and we avoid it because it leaves us feeling uncomfortable and honestly vulnerable. And that's a feeling that a lot of people just don't like. But shame gets its power from being unspeakable. When it's ignored, when it's avoided, when it becomes silent, it actually spreads more fear and encourages more negative behavior and thinking. So we have to shine a little light on shame. And I think it's important to reframe how we view shame as well. And it's important to understand the difference between shame and guilt. So shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and we are therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. And this is a definition from Brené Brown, one of my favorite authors. And the difference between shame and guilt is that guilt is something we feel. Again, it's a negative, heavy emotion, but it's when we feel we have done something wrong. We have made a bad choice. And we feel guilt over having done a choice that we later regret. Shame, however, is the internalization of that deep regret and sadness. It turns in on ourselves and we feel we are bad. We, not just that we've done a bad thing, but we, to our core, are bad. We are unlovable. We are unworthy. And we all experience shame. It's universal. It's a primitive emotion shared by everyone. And it is part of the human connection. And it's also not easy to talk about. Even mentioning the word shame makes us want to hide. We shrink. And as children, especially when we experience shame, it's a natural recoil where we want to become small or invisible to avoid the harsh feelings of shame. But talking about it gives us a sense of control and it gives us some power and it helps us actually start healing. Because when we fear it, we actually don't allow any healing. But let's get into a little bit of the neurobiology of shame and a little bit of the biology of even the brain in order to help us understand how this works. So again, shame is a emotion that we feel, but it also gets lodged in our brain. So there are some theories that shame is not necessarily all bad in that it actually is protective and part of our survival mechanism. And if we think of it like that, it's a survival response. And if you think back to a time where when you were a child and maybe you went to reach out for a hot stove and you were quickly corrected by a caregiver, that initial response is going to cause a change in your physiology. Although it's good that you weren't allowed to touch the hot stove because that would have brought harm. But that initial response was startling. So let's talk about what the brain does in these type of situations. So let's talk about the autonomic nervous system, and not to get too deep in the science, but I think it's important to help understand how this becomes something we internalize because it becomes hardwired in our brain. So the autonomic nervous system is part of our nervous system that controls and regulates the internal organs without the need for us to think about it. And there are two branches of the autonomic nervous system. The ANS is the acronym for autonomic nervous system. And there is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, a lot of people are familiar with those two terms. So, the sympathetic nervous system, again, is our fight or flight response. This is responsible for connecting our bodies to our brain through our spinal cord. When we perceive danger, it's our sympathetic nervous system that kicks into high gear. It prepares us to fight, flight, or freeze. And then there's a fourth one that's fawn. But let's just focus on these knee-jerk sort of built-in hardwired reactions when there is a perceived danger. And this is the part of our nervous system that protects us from danger. So even in that light, some people would say, oh, well, the sympathetic nervous system, when you're stuck in chronic stress, that's bad. Well, yes, that is. But in a short burst, the sympathetic nervous system is protective. So what happens in these instances is that our heart rate increases, the blood flow goes from our digestive system to our muscles, and we then get ready to fight, flight, or freeze. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is compromised of nerve fibers and cranial nerves. Different part. Their primary response is through the vagus nerve and the lumbar spinal nerves. Now, upon stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system, these important structures increase digestive secretions and reduce the heart rate. And these are the relaxing, calming types of stimuli that we get when we are relaxed. And it's calming to the body when the parasympathetic nervous system is stimulated. So, how does this relate to shame? When we are faced with shame, the brain reacts as if we are facing physical danger and activates the sympathetic nervous system, generating this fight, flight, freeze response. The flight response triggers the feeling of needing to disappear, to become small, to become invisible. So, especially when this happens in childhood, the child will literally look smaller and become smaller. In comparison, the fight response is going to express itself as a verbal and potentially behavioral aggression by the embarrassed person to the one who caused them to feel ashamed. And then the freeze response is what normally occurs when people are faced with trauma where they feel trapped and powerless. They freeze, which allows a survival situation where intolerable things are happening to us. So all of this, the freeze response specifically, it upsets our ability to think clearly. And when we are stuck in situations like that, it actually causes us to not be able to think in a way that we otherwise would. So from birth, we are hardwired to belong. We need to interact with our caregivers and we seek connection with them. That's the human connection. But soon after birth, we begin storing in our brain all these signals that our caregivers give us about what is acceptable and not. Remember the hot stove? Running into the street, same kind of thing. Whenever this happens, we have an initial startle reflex. Initially, the sympathetic nervous system is turned on, and all of those responses occur. When we are told no by running into the street, then the sympathetic nervous system, the excitatory response, is activated. So then, hopefully, as a child, we freeze. We don't continue running into the dangerous street. But then we may burst out in tears or have this sudden increase in emotion, which is a normal response when the sympathetic nervous system has been activated. And also, when we feel shame for doing something wrong, we immediately recognize our actions as needing to be calmed by the caregiver. Now, what happens when the child runs into the street, told no, there's an instant startle or stop response, and then there may be this burst of tears. The caregiver then runs over to the child, hopefully, and says, that's dangerous. Let me give you a hug. Everything's okay. I know you're scared. Streets are dangerous and scary. And then you get this calming, soothing, which then activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And then you're able to process that activation from the sympathetic. So, but what happens if that doesn't happen? So this is where the idea of toxic shame starts to get thrown around. And this is where you're exposed to arousal, sympathetic nervous system types of activation, but then there's no parasympathetic nervous system to come in and calm and soothe. So in these instances, we, as a child, have no idea how to reconcile that in our brain. And that's where shame really starts to take root, because we cannot identify this act as separate from ourselves. And our brain doesn't know how to differentiate that the caregivers who might be struggling with their own addictions or mental health issues or unhealed traumas don't have the capacity to soothe us. And therefore, we're left to our own devices. And what happens is our brains say we're unlovable and don't belong. And then we go along with it. Our little brains believe that. And that's something that will stick with us unless we go back later and heal. So there's two parts that are important to this. Number one, this is a belief that we form in that moment that unless we go back and change, because it's hardwired into our brain, that becomes the lens through which we view ourselves and the world. Secondly, we also don't understand, and what becomes underdeveloped is our ability to self-soothe. We don't give ourselves permission to have compassion and be that nurturing voice that we need in that moment. And that will stunt us as adults, because compassion is what brings healing to shame. Self-compassion, soothing. But when that's underdeveloped in childhood, we struggle to do that for ourselves in adulthood when other triggering of shameful events happen. Like I am faced with a divorce. I am faced with bankruptcy. All of a sudden, I am flunking out of school twice. I am in recovery. I am infertile. Like all these big things can just heap this shame onto us later in life, and they are triggering events. And we don't know how to soothe. A lot of addictions also stem from unhealed shame, because we are constantly trying to prove our worth, our value, our success, and we're seeking other means to do so. So how do we get out of this network of shame? How do we get out of the cycle of shame? The important thing I think to take away from this is that when we are talking about shame and when we are trying to shed light on this topic, I think it's important for several things to come to light. This is something that happens to us all. It is universal. It's not just by experiencing trauma that we have shame. Number two, it is somewhat protective and it helps us survive in a family unit. And because of that, then we can understand how it is that we heal it. Now, the wonderful thing about our brain, even though things get hardwired from shame, there's also something called neuroplasticity. This allows the brain to learn new things. Awesome. That's great. That's what we want to take into our healing journey. Your brain has the capacity to develop new ways of thinking and behaving. That neuroplasticity is what allows healing. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. And one of the things about trauma and shame, but let's just say shame in and of itself, is that it is the underpinning now for creating potential lifelong struggles with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addictions, low self-esteem. It can manifest in digestive issues, in thyroid issues, actually, in chronic illnesses, chronic pain, can all be stemmed to unhealed trauma, which is why it's important for a general health and wellness standpoint that we look at the unhealed shame in our lives, because it's rooted in our childhood and we can be triggered in adulthood. And when those triggers come up, it's often an area and an opportunity to do the healing work. And we struggle with giving ourselves that compassion. We struggle with nurturing and allowing ourselves this healing journey. I think that's why so many people potentially resist investing in themselves, is when you've had shame, you find it really difficult to give yourself permission to nurture and care for yourself now on this very, very basic level. But back to neuroplasticity, because that's our friend. So the damage to our self-esteem that happens through shame limits our ability to seek out and enjoy satisfying relationships. This is where shame can also impact relationships, not just the wellness of our physical and mental health, but wellness in relation to our relationships with people, with coworkers, with our friends, with our family, with our partner. And it may also keep us from achieving the level of personal and professional success that we're capable, because we simply just don't believe we're worthy of having good things. So we may be consumed with self-hatred and rage and feeling alienated and lonely, because that's where shame likes to hide, is in the shadows. And in short, we're terrified. We're afraid to trust someone else because that person may hurt us too. These examples are how shame can limit us. And some of us will also become codependent because we feel we must care for others. We become people pleasers. We insist on taking care of others at the expense of taking care of ourselves. And we may be afraid that once we found someone, that we have to maintain the relationship at all costs because they may leave us. That's how we stay in unhealthy, toxic relationships, because we're afraid of what it is to stand in our own light, to stand in our own beauty. And I have a phrase that I use with Sylvia Soul, and it's returning home to you. And when we actually take on the journey of returning home to ourselves, that's exactly what it is. It's returning to the essence of who we are. And we are love. We are light. And by shedding light on shame and by talking about the uncomfortable, by moving into the vulnerable spaces that this is going to create and allow opportunity for growth and healing with this neuroplasticity to learn new things, we can actually shed and step out of this cloak of shame that we're all invisibly, unknowingly walking around wearing. And it's through the healing journey. It's through recognizing how this invisible cloak of shame that is sprinkled into all of our lives, unless we go back and do that healing work, we are always looking through the lens of shame. We are always looking through the lens of lack, which creates lonely, potentially sad, anxious individuals who are not living up to their potential. Wellness and well-being is all levels. It's physical, emotional, energetic, relational. And shame touches on and can inhibit wellness in all of those areas. Teaching this is the most important thing that I do. This is my work in my lifetime, helping others rid themselves of shame. And the thing about shame and trauma is you can heal it with yourself. When you are the person who goes back and does the inner child work, you are bringing witness to and allowing that self-compassion that you didn't get to learn as a child. That's something you can learn. That's the beauty of neuroplasticity and the beauty of healing. And if I can help you along in your journey, take a look at the courses that I offer. The membership is about helping you learn to love yourself every day, providing that community of support so that you have someone to walk alongside you in your journey of healing. The courses are more in depth. They give you the tools to access, to learn how to love you, to remove those limiting barriers that we all have to loving ourselves, so that we can see the world through new lens, through new eyes, through really knowing our worth, when we understand what it is to truly come home to ourselves. Thank you for listening and joining me today on the Soul via Soul podcast. This topic, the topic of shame, is a heavy one. I get that. And it's one that we need to talk more about because it affects every aspect of our wellness. And to be a person who is well means that we have wellness on every aspect in our life. And unfortunately, shame is layered in there until we go back and do the healing work. And I know it's scary, and I know that there's resistance. And when you invest in yourself, it will have rippling effects, not only for your life, but the life of your children and generations ahead that you will never meet. When we heal ourselves and we give ourselves permission to invest in our own growth and healing, it will have the ability to stop generational trauma. It is the opportunity for you to say, the buck stops here. I am going to be the one that changes the life for future generations. It is that powerful, which is why it's the most important mission of my life. So I hope you give yourself permission to invest in you and start on the healing journey of returning home to you.